Vladimir Lenin is little more than a museum piece now to most Russians. A curiosity, a relic of a lost world.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the 20 figures in history whose actions, beliefs, and/or policies have been subjects of heavy debate. We will not be including people who are universally regarded as monsters, like Adolf Hitler.
Extremely radical, revolutionary figure that was going to bring more change than they had seen since the time of the prophets.
Number 20, Thomas Edison. Often called the most prolific inventor in American history, we have Thomas Edison to thank for numerous life-changing creations, including the phonograph and the electric light bulb. Then again, maybe Edison didn't actually give us these things? Maybe we just think he did.
What's that? What's that thing you're working on?
Well, it's a light bulb and...
A light bulb! Light bulb! I invented that. Me! I'm Thomas Edison. I invented the light bulb. What's it do?
Edison has long been accused of taking credit for other people's work and engaging in ruthless business tactics, painting him as more of a shrewd businessman than a creative genius.
He counterattacked Tesla's success by launching a brutal smear campaign, one of the nastiest in the history of American industry.
He was also known to cause harm to animals, like killing an elephant on Coney Island and being complicit in the electrocution of horses while helping to develop the electric chair. That is also another point of contention, with many having since argued against the merits of capital punishment. Number 19, Mother Teresa.
She was a charlatan, pure and simple.
Her very name is synonymous with good deeds, having won the Nobel Peace Prize and being officially canonized by the Catholic Church. But the truth is actually a bit more complex than that. Mother Teresa has been criticized for her dogmatic views on contraception and abortion, but that's the least of it. The medical care she provided was described as haphazard, with a spiritual approach in place of genuine medical knowledge. Enormous sums of money that she received as charity may have been mismanaged.
She gave more money to the Vatican Bank than entire countries. The first thing you ask is, what are they doing with the money?
She defended a priest accused of sexual assault and kept curious friends, like Haitian dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier and fraudster Charles Keating. And some have even argued that she engaged in forced conversions by baptizing patients without their consent.
I don't believe that there is any human being who doesn't believe in God, unless they are mental.
Number 18, Oliver Cromwell.
The controversy over Cromwell as hero or villain has been fiercely argued over for centuries.
While he is celebrated by some as a champion of democracy and religious freedom, others view Oliver Cromwell as a dictator who ruled with an iron fist, including future leader Henry VIII, who is equally controversial. The Cromwell family has links to Henry VIII, and Oliver would later help execute Charles I and establish the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland.
A few months later, the Army Council declared him Lord Protector, King, in all but name.
Cromwell has long been criticized for his violence and dictatorial actions, like abusing his power with the new model army. He is also fiercely criticized for his brutal conquest of Ireland, which included killing up to 50% of the native population, sending the country into famine, and taking 50,000 native Irish as indentured laborers. Number 17, Martin Luther.
Initially, Martin Luther was only calling for a renewal of the Church and its faith. But the Pope and the Emperor saw him as a threat, and he was demonized by both.
A hugely influential figure in Christian history, Martin Luther formed the backbone of the Protestant Reformation and challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. But with great change comes great division.
A man branded a heretic by the Church, celebrated like the Messiah in the German city of Worms.
Luther's actions led directly to a schism within Western Christianity as Protestant denominations broke away from Roman Catholicism, and his call for radical change provoked wars and violent upheavals.
A bloody uprising staged by peasants demanding greater rights and freedom. Encouraged by Luther's Reformation ideas, they used his arguments to justify their revolt.
His late writings also expressed vehemently anti-Semitic views, and he publicly promoted the burning of synagogues.
He said, burn their synagogues, burn their books, chase them off your lands. Never give them a decent job, give them a good beating.
Some even contended that Luther's anti-Semitic philosophy eventually inspired the creation of the Nazi Party. Now that is not a good legacy to leave behind. Number 16. Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre was a divisive figure in his day, and he's a divisive figure today.
Moi, qui suis né esclave de la liberté, on m'appelle un tyran. Moi qui ai vécu le martyre pour la République, on m'appelle un dictateur.
Robespierre advocated strongly for many important rights and progressive stances. However, he was one of the leading figures of the French Reign of Terror, and his reputation is marred by his incredible penchant for violence. Many see him as an authoritarian figure who prioritized ideological purity over human rights, and many argue that he hoped to form a dictatorship in France. He also enforced his revolutionary laws through force with his radical political group La Montagne, and authorized countless executions via the guillotine. But he himself became a victim of the blade and was executed in 1794. Number 15. Henry Ford. Thanks to his innovative practices, Henry Ford provided vehicles to the middle class and changed the very nature not only of transportation, but urban infrastructure and economic industry.
With the Model T, the most successful car in history, and the groundbreaking $5 a day wage, Ford ushered in the modern world.
But he was also a terrible person. Ford could be a poor boss, lobbying against labor unions and often sending investigators to pry into his employees' private lives. He also had a negative view against women in the workplace, stating, quote, "I consider women only a temporary factor in the industry." But perhaps worst of all, Ford was also an enormous anti-Semite, spreading terrible conspiracy theories about Jewish internationalism through his various publications.
One of the nation's richest men, he despised the wealthy and feared a vast conspiracy threatened to bring him down.
Number 14. Karl Marx. Author of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, Karl Marx is one of the most divisive philosophers the world has ever seen.
He was seen as so seditious that he couldn't find a home anywhere in continental Europe.
Marx promoted a societal revolution through his many publications, arguing against the merits of capitalism and claiming that its very structure would eventually promote its downfall. In turn, he promoted a socialist mode of production, which is the basis of communism and the ideologies of socialist states like the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. While some praise Marx's critiques of capitalism, others argue that his ideology led to oppressive regimes and destructive economic failures.
Whether he foresaw it or not, his impact on revolutionary movements from Russia to China to Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea has been immense.
Number 13. Napoleon Bonaparte. We return to the French Revolution, sorta, with Napoleon, arguably the greatest military leader in human history.
Take the enemy from the rear and drive them to Masséna. We'll chop them to pieces.
But like any great military leader, his reputation is decidedly mixed, owing to his legacy of death and destruction. His unquenchable thirst for expansion plunged Europe into years of devastating warfare, and it's believed that up to 6 million people died during the Napoleonic Wars.
Prepare to fire! Fire! Fire!
Furthermore, despite promoting equality, he reinstated forced labor in French colonies after it had been abolished during the Revolution. Some regard Napoleon as a liberator, forced to do unspeakable things in the name of expansion. Others, a power-hungry tyrant.
I love France too much. All I've desired was its glory.
Number 12. Che Guevara.
Che Guevara was a doctor, a revolutionary, and to the Latin American anti-establishment, a Christ-like martyr figure.
You probably know his face from various t-shirts and dorm room posters. Che Guevara was instrumental in the Cuban Revolution, partnering with Fidel Castro and his 26th of July movement, and overthrowing Fulgencio Batista, who was receiving support from the American government. His status as a countercultural icon clashes with the reality that Guevara endorsed the use of brutal violence and was a ruthless revolutionary who oversaw summary trials and executions.
Che Guevara organized hundreds of trials and put to death possibly 500 or even more Batista supporters.
The international community saw him as a murderer as a result of this.
He also contributed to establishing an authoritarian government, violated human rights, and helped incite revolutions in other countries, which eventually led to his capture and execution. According to some critics, Che Guevara is little more than a terrorist who sought to overthrow governments through warfare.
Che Guevara is revered in Cuba today. You'll see him on a peso note. School children each day give a daily chant to him.
Number 11, Richard Nixon.
It was a political scandal that changed our country forever.
No matter the good he did, Nixon's legacy will forever be tarnished by the Watergate scandal. Nixon accomplished quite a lot in his time as president, like reducing American involvement in Vietnam, establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, and easing relations with the Soviet Union. But he also spied on political opponents and had attempted to use federal officials to obstruct justice when investigators examined the break-in at Watergate. As impeachment proceedings loomed, rather than face almost certain removal from office, Richard Nixon made history by becoming the first U.S. president to resign.
To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
He left behind a more cynical America where public trust in government was at a historic low. Number 10. Benjamin Netanyahu.
The days when the Jewish people remain passive in the face of genocidal enemies are over.
He's the longest-serving prime minister in the history of Israel, having held office on and off since 1996. Despite this, Netanyahu is enormously controversial in his native country. Supporters believe he has strengthened Israel. Critics argue that he has hindered peace negotiations by promoting settlement expansions in the occupied territories, and many accuse him of employing excessive force during military operations. In fact, critics argue that Netanyahu has engaged in acts of genocide and is set to face charges for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Branding Israel's leaders and soldiers as war criminals will pour jet fuel on the fires of anti-Semitism, those fires that are already raging on the campuses of America and across capitals around the world.
Many also blame him for the failure to anticipate and prevent the Israel-Hamas war, and he has since been the target of protests calling for his removal. Number 9. Vladimir Putin.
In Russia, statehood comes first, and human rights come last. They use any means to prove the state is the most important, more important than a human.
Another highly controversial world leader, Vladimir Putin has run Russia since 1999, making him the longest-running leader since Stalin. Some admire the effectiveness of his strongman tactics. However, many critics have argued that Putin has transformed the country into an authoritarian dictatorship, as evidenced by the 2020 constitutional referendum that gave him more power and drew accusations of corruption. He also controls most major media outlets in Russia and violently suppresses independent journalists who speak out against his corruption and dictatorial rule. And that's to say nothing of his human rights violations, suppression of political opponents, and invading Ukraine. Putin has been issued an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for various crimes against humanity.
It will now be up to the international community to actually carry out the warrant, as the court has no police force of its own to actually enforce it.
Number 8. Margaret Thatcher.
There were no half measures with Margaret Thatcher. She was the most loved Prime Minister and the most hated.
Being the first female British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher's place in the history books is firmly secured. But aside from that, Thatcher was also a very popular leader, known for her widespread reforms and uncompromising nature.
I'll do my bit. I know you'll do yours.
However, her ideological shift towards neoliberal policies is not favored by all, and she certainly didn't finish strong. Thatcher was not loved by laborers after defeating the miners' unions in 1985. Her economic policies led to increased inequality, progressives hated her conservative leanings, and her infamous poll tax was widely hated for affecting lower-income workers.
I think that she was to blame for most of the ills in society, and most of the things that poor people and ill people now being blamed for were her fault.
She eventually grew wildly unpopular within her own cabinet and resigned from office in 1990. Number 7. Fidel Castro.
Few men in the world have been as idolized and at the same time as hated as Cuba's Fidel Castro.
Everything we said about Che Guevara also applies to Fidel Castro, but Castro takes the controversy one step further by leading Cuba between 1959 and 2008.
For nearly 5 decades, he determined the fate of generations of Cubans. while becoming the ideological godfather of left-wing leaders all over Latin America.
With the help of his brother Raúl and Guevara, Castro violently overthrew Batista and established himself as the leader of the country. Castro played a huge role in the Cold War by allying with the Soviet Union and allowing them to place nuclear weapons in the country, resulting in the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And like the Soviet Union, Castro turned Cuba into a socialist state, turning himself into a dictator who oversaw the ruining of the country's economy and the mass exodus of native Cubans. He represents significant social achievement alongside terrible failures of human rights.
Until the very end, Fidel Castro was a proud man who scoffed at international and domestic criticism, always insisting that his was the most democratic system in the world.
Number 6. Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Recep Tayyip Erdogan became the 25th Prime Minister of Turkey and has held the leadership position since 2003. This despite the fact that he was banned from politics after being convicted for inciting religious hatred. Erdogan's administration has been criticized for authoritarian practices and sending Turkey into a democratic backslide.
European countries have repeatedly condemned Turkey for the attacks on civil liberties.
His government's crackdown on journalists is seen as an assault on free speech, and the 2017 constitutional referendum significantly expanded his presidential powers.
I'm telling you to stay in your lane.
He is also known for his military interventions in Syria, and his government's actions after the failed 2016 coup resulted in a large-scale crackdown on perceived dissenters.
I can say that the members of the party that I am the founder of will be hand in hand with our people in city squares and punish those that are responsible.
Early on, he was admired for his advances in religious freedom and minority rights. However, his legacy is quickly being tarnished. Number 5. Donald Trump. The business magnate turned president is a polarizing figure, with his adherents steadfastly loyal to him and seeing him as a victim of a supposed, quote, deep state conspiracy. One of the most controversial figures in modern history, Trump received widespread criticism throughout his presidency, with his policies on immigration, healthcare, and climate change stoking incredible division. His approach to governance was unorthodox, his foreign policy decisions were destructive, and many argue that his rhetoric emboldened extremist groups. And let's not forget the whole January 6th fiasco.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Trump is the only American president to be impeached twice and has been indicted on numerous charges, including sexual abuse, financial fraud, and falsifying business records.
I just went through a rigged trial in New York. They know it's a corrupt system. They know all about it, but with your help, less than 5 months from now, and we're going, and I'll tell you what, we have to change the system. We have to straighten out what's going on in these courts.
Unsurprisingly, many scholars rank him as one of the worst American presidents. Number 4. Julius Caesar. When you're assassinated by your own senators, you know your plans have gone off the rails. Credited with kickstarting the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar performed many great deeds and is responsible for many positive reforms throughout the Republic.
Caesar begins a massive rebuilding of Rome. He builds libraries. He builds a new forum named after him. This building project provides thousands of jobs for Roman citizens and glorifies the city as it has never been glorified before.
However, it was his political maneuvering and accumulation of power that made him a central figure of controversy. Caesar set a precedent for authoritarian rule and appointed himself dictator for life, undermining Republican institutions.
Dictator is a form of exceptional power that was supposed to be temporary. Caesar is using this as a fig leaf to hide the fact that there are no limits to his influence and power.
He was also a fantastic military commander, leading many to both fear and respect his authority. However, many of his contemporaries began to view him as a power-hungry tyrant and had him assassinated, prematurely ending his rule and instigating civil war. Number 3. Vladimir Lenin. The Soviet Union is arguably the most well-known socialist state in history, and that's thanks to the work of Vladimir Lenin.
There are an estimated 14,000 statues of this man in the Soviet Union. That means that wherever you went in the USSR, there was probably at least one Lenin thinking about you, taking care of you. or just watching you.
A revolutionary socialist from a young age, Lenin helped establish the USSR and its communist ideologies, leading to a highly divisive reputation. Lenin's government oversaw land redistribution, which benefited many of the poor, but it was also responsible for the Red Terror, which included mass arrests, executions, and human rights abuses, and he was involved in wars with massive casualties. Furthermore, the suppression of opposition, mass censorship, and strict control over media created an environment that critics argue was repressive and undemocratic. His regime led to economic stagnation and authoritarian rule under subsequent leaders, resulting in a very questionable legacy.
Vladimir Lenin is little more than a museum piece now to most Russians. A curiosity, a relic of a lost world.
Number 2. Christopher Columbus.
I never liked Columbus.
There are questionable legacies, and then there's what Christopher Columbus left behind. Columbus is known for the widespread European discovery of the Americas, and his journeys changed the course of human history.
By all the powers vested in me, I claim this island and name it San Salvador.
But his arrival in the Americas led to widespread violence, rampant disease, and the enslavement of indigenous populations. It's estimated that European settlers dwindled the native population by as much as 80%, leading some scholars to label it an act of genocide. Furthermore, his voyages marked the beginning of an era of aggressive European colonialism. The mythologizing of Columbus as an intrepid hero ignores many darker truths about the man and his impact on the indigenous population. Before we unveil our top pick, here are a few honorable mentions. Hillary Clinton. She blew the Benghazi response and used a private email server as Secretary of State.
I'm not going to make any excuses. It was a mistake, and I take responsibility for that.
Niccolo Machiavelli. The beliefs he shared have caused his name to represent deception and tyranny.
The Renaissance strategist Niccolo Machiavelli, associated with many a plotting politician.
Silvio Berlusconi, a brash leader who attracted controversy for his crimes and ethics.
Silvio Berlusconi was sentenced to 4 years behind bars for tax evasion.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. Number 1. Jesus Christ.
Overall, Jesus' formative years were relatively simple. But one day, the boy Jesus becomes a man who challenges an empire and earns the name King of Kings.
At the top of our list stands a figure whose influence on the world is simply unparalleled. Scholars universally agree that Jesus was a real person, that he was baptized around the year 28 CE, and that he was crucified. That's about all we know for sure, but there's no denying that he altered the course of world history.
Extremely radical, revolutionary figure that was going to bring more change than they had seen since the time of the prophets.
His actions upended the social and religious norms of the time, and people have been fighting over his teachings ever since, both literally and figuratively. Christianity's historical association with colonialism has added another layer of controversy, with many arguing that its spread was a case of cultural assimilation. Christ's teachings brought about profound changes, but the many controversies surrounding these changes cannot be ignored. What do you make of these people? Let us know in the comments below.
This idea of a rigged justice system plays well with his base of support.
Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.